Hello, thank you very much for accepting our invitation for our COMTOG project. My first question is, could you please introduce yourself and your field of research or field of work?
For sure, thanks for having me. My name is Moyra Turkington, and I am the leader of the Warbirds Project, which is a role-playing game, live action and tabletop game publishing organization that is focused on recovering the stories of historical women. I run the design studio Unruly Designs, and I've been in the gaming industry for about 25 years, and I have a background in theater and cultural studies, and a long period of time I worked in systems analysis. So it all kind of folds into to my work.
Thank you. And how did you start Unruly Designs, and what are the challenges the women's game design collective face today?
So I started, I had been working in games for quite some time, and I actually had a discussion with my partner, an argument with my partner about flying aces and what it took to become a flying ace, like how many wins in a battle in an airplane would it take to become. And so we live in an age of the internet, and so we don't have to have those arguments. We can just look them up. And we did, and found a long list of flying aces. And on that list was Lydia Litvak, which is a Russian Soviet World War II flying ace. And the link for her name was red linked. So it was in Wikipedia. What that means is there is a person who is acknowledged as being a flying ace, but that person does not have their own Wikipedia page. We don't have more information on them, but they are there. And I was like, there was a female flying ace in World War II. And I decided to look it up, and I ended up writing the Wikipedia page. And I got very interested in the history of women in World War II and uncovering the ways that they contributed, the ways their stories were overlooked, and the effects of the war on them in terms of being in occupied territories, being refugees. And I decided I was going to start doing a body of games on them. And at first, this was just a small project for myself. I was thinking of probably publishing them, but it was just a tiny side project that I was working on, and it quickly took over everything. So we started the Warbirds Collective and released an anthology of games. And those games were a diverse set of experiences about women's experiences in World War II. Warbirds has grown since then. To encompass women on the front lines of history is the way that we often put it, meaning places where women have been forgotten but have made critical fights and had made brought critical value to the world. So we recently wrote a game about the Searchers of the Dead and the Black Plague, and we're currently working on some labor movement games. There's probably a dozen other games in development right now. And Unruly Designs as a publishing house came out of the work of Warbirds because we needed a venue for publishing. So we had to learn that. So in the second part of your question, you asked about challenges that women face in the industry today, in the gaming industry. And I would say there's a number of folds of this. I'd say when we are making games about women's content, our games tend to be overlooked and to not receive funding or attention, or people don't want to people en masse don't want to play them. They are still considered marginal games because they are about women's experiences. I would say that's a big one. I would say too that there is then a whole bunch of financial challenges. A game set centered on women's experiences, and especially game sets set by women and other people of marginalized gender, will receive less funding, and so will not make it to print or publication. And also there is the very large world of online harassment, abuse, death threats, those kind of things that happen, things like Gamergate. We saw a number of years ago of like online misogyny, and anybody who is marginalized in complex ways, so people of color or people who are queer also have to face, or people who are Jewish have to face that level of hate as well when they're trying to get their work out. So there's barriers to access at every step along the way.
Many of your games being a provocative LARP, a freeform or a tabletop game with complex topics are set in the 1930s, or rather during the 1940s, the Second World War. Why did you choose this difficult time period to portray?
So to me, the World War II is our edge of living memory. We still have people alive who are alive back then. We are losing them at a rapid pace. it is the edge of living memory to me is where we lose our continuum to history. So we remember things that happened before then, but once there are no living survivors, we start to rapidly lose the lessons and information that is happening at that time. And eras like the Great Wars are specifically subject to Hollywoodization or media or hypermedialization, and that this era of media changes the narratives of what those wars were there, what was in those wars, of what they meant, of who participated in them, in what was important about them. They are subject to victor narratives. They are subject to wanting to tell the stories of the soldiers in action, fighting and dying, and hyper focus on violence and hyper focus on the victimization when they do look at other people who are affected by the wars. And that era of time, specifically World War II, has a lot of parallels to our current era, right? The rise in xenophobia, the rise of hate, the rise of fascism in real ways, the rise of fake truth or propaganda or post-truth. And so that era has all of this wealthy body of knowledge that we are quickly losing, that is super important to learn for our lessons right now, for how we navigate the world that we're in. And so the more I looked into those stories, the more they taught me that the way I had been taught history was incorrect and incomplete. And it made me upset because if I had known that information earlier, I might have been a different kind of person, or I might have been better prepared to deal with the current situations that we're in. And so games became a way to me to express the connections between that period of time and this period of time, and to establish a continuum of experience of women and other people of marginalized gender across those ages.
How do you make sure as a storyteller or game designer that you do justice to topics such as the topics you choose in your game design? And how do you balance between a personal story or stories of a group and between larger history?
So I think that we all have a kind of a basis of what the big narratives are, right? We know what happened generally in the war, and I use personal stories to reconnect and recontextualize that period of time. I am Walter Benjamin once had a famous set of writing about brushing history against the grain, against how in the periods of times after great conflicts, we distill the meaning and events and the knowledge of that event down into finer and finer pieces, so that we have a single clear narrative that says this is what that event meant to us. But that distilling loses everybody who didn't win the war, or who wasn't a victim of the war, or who didn't exist outside the conflict. And so what he said is there's a process of brushing history against the grain. So to take the narrative that we have and push back on it, you can imagine velvet pushing back on it and showing a different texture of the event, or recontextualizing or refusing it with better context to better understand it. And so what I look for is moments of history that tell us something really important, and personal narratives that existed at the time, but I don't also borrow the lives of people. So talk about those events deeply contextualized with personal experiences. So in as much as possible, reading firsthand accounts or survivor stories or interviews, or the data that exists in history that tells us something very different about the period of time we're looking for. And I build it from people up, especially since my particular medium, games, and not just games, but role-playing games that are physical and analog. So I am a person taking on that character and enacting that as if I were in a play. It is a hyper-personalization, or a different level of personalization that I might get in a video game, or than which is itself kind of a more iconic, like, owning of a character than I might get if I was just reading a novel or an account of something. And so personal stories, and developing the right tenure of personal stories for people to take on, to be able to understand that period in history better, that's where I look for the balance.
Why do you think the gaming industry has avoided topics of mass violence, tragedies like the Holocaust or refugee crisis and violence against women for so long? And why why it still does avoid such topics?
So I think it's multifold. I think a lot of people just want games to be fun. They just want games to be accesses to agency. I want to be in control. I want to feel like I'm in a different place. I want to feel like I'm an action hero. I think a lot of games have historically focused on that. And video games, analog role-playing games all come out of a history of war games. And those war games were, how do I be the hero and go tell my story? And so what we have is a kind of a hyper-fetishization of I play the enactors of violence. And when you have been doing that or engaging that in a long period of time, asking questions about the people who are not the enactors of violence, but the people who might be in the town you just blew up, or the people who might have been left at home, or the people who might be starving to death because of the incursion, we don't want to look at those stories because those stories take away from our fun of video games. I also think we're less interested in the stories of people that were affected than the people who took big heroic action. We've been trained to look for the man in the spotlight. And I think that there's also a pervasive worry about getting it wrong. For those people who want to be in those stories, to look at those stories, the idea that they may misrepresent stories, especially along very serious subject matter like the Holocaust, are concerned, both sometimes in play and things that people won't want to play that. And also, if I got it wrong, the consequences are so big. And so they get turned off the idea of engaging with it unless they can find access or sponsorship or someone or large studios to help them. And large studios don't find them marketable. So I think, once again, multifold barriers that exist there and lots of pieces that get in the way of people wanting to engage with the subject matter.
What type of background research has been done for your games? And my other question is, did you consult experts, historians, or survivors of atrocities, survivors from the Second World War? And how did they contribute to the realization of your project or projects?
So each different game that we write has different resources available, and some of them are very rich. For example, because North American documentation is very deep, there's a lot of information available for things like the home front activities that happened in the US during World War II. English language is easily accessible, the onlineification of those kind of things. So it makes a lot of information very readily available. And so there's a wide berth of everything that you can read. Some stories are much more difficult because they're part of, for example, Strauss, our game about the Holocaust, was of a period of time, was based on a strike that happened in 1943 in Berlin, where the Christian wives of Jewish men protested to return their husbands home to them. This is a story that there is some evidence that the information in it was suppressed at the beginning, that information was legitimately destroyed at the end of the war and forgotten, and then revived later by an academic, Nathan Stoltzfus, who put out who came across threads of information about it and put on radio broadcast and invited survivors to come talk to him to reinvigorate, to reflood that floodplain of history and rediscover what it was. And so there's a lot of ways in women's stories that have to kind of come around the edges. You have to look at different kinds of records. People aren't focusing on writing about the thing, but there's lots of data around the thing. We have to look for those. We look for personal stories wherever they're found because they speak often the most truth of the living relationship with them. We speak to academics, especially academics with things like PhD focuses on very specific niche things, because those are where we find people who have done the work to reinvigorate history. Nathan Stoltzfus being one of them on the Rosenstrauss project. And so pretty much we get whatever we can get our hands on, anything original for sure, anything directly from survivors. And then we try and fill in the details around them by looking to city records, arrest records, those kind of things that will help us understand what the lived experience of the people's lives were at the time.
I think you partly answered this question, but I will ask it anyway. So in your view, can video games or any form of serious transformative gaming play a role in addressing society's collective memory of certain events?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that's true. I believe that there's a place for education, just information transfer. More than that, I believe there's a particular amount of like reinvigorating firsthand experience. A person playing a game will never know what happened to the people playing the game as if they were that people. They will never have 100% of a real life lived experience. But there is a distinct difference between reading about an account and having anchoring in an account, putting on the mantle of a character to think through the moral questions or the concerns or the risks that they're facing in their lives and make decisions based on what they understand of that person in history, allows people to think more complexly about the history. And complexity is a super important piece in our modern political climate. Like, we are becoming more and more simplistic in the way that we communicate in the media. Our history, the farther along we way, becomes more and more a single narrative. We lose the complexity, and when we lose the complexity, we learn the knowledge and lessons that happen. We might have facts, but we don't have truths, if that makes sense. And so games allow us to more deeply engage with subject matter and ideas, to put ourselves in the shoes in as much as possible of someone who lived in that experience and understand that time period in a new way. And then I believe that there's also like the reflections of time. There's relevancy is an important piece. So there's the piece of understanding history, but then there's also the piece of transference, of taking what I learned about history and putting it into action in the world around us. And that's a critical part of transformative games for me. So I don't just want to learn about what happened. I don't just want to better understand it. I don't just want to empathize more deeply with it. I also want to learn how it reflects and changes the way I see my world today, how I better understand my world today, and how I'm better informed to move forward today. So a game like Rosenstrasse was meant to have a look at the period of time where civil liberties were being suppressed in the 10 years before the war, because we tend to think of the Holocaust as this isolated incident that happened during the war. But of course, there was a long road to getting there, where little pieces of people's lives were taken away until we got to citizenship. And that was even 5 years or so before the war. And then, we took away phones and radios and access to things. We made people move. We took away their property. And all of that time, we started sending people away. Like the Reich started sending people away. And so this period of time before the war is super important because it tells us how to see the signs that are coming for a collapse of civil liberties as they come away. And the interesting thing about that is we found relevance in this game. We found relevance in this game when we first started working on it in 2015. And we had our first draft of the game in our first play test in October of 2017, 4 days before the election. And we, at that point, thought it was an urgent story that we needed to read and learn. And I feel now, these 6 years later, that it is ever more urgent and ever more important to tell those kinds of stories. So yeah, I believe strongly the games can have transformative value.
Can fully analog LARPs and tabletop role-playing games be a useful tool in fighting back against online hate, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust denial or distortion? I think you partly answered this question.
I did. I can move this into more practicalities though, because when doing Rosenstrasse, we actually did studies with players. We exposed players. We tested students for their knowledge of history, for their knowledge of the Holocaust, for their empathy levels around people in the Holocaust based on like very loose information. Then we had them play the game and we measured things afterwards. And we encountered a lot of different scenarios in our playtest that were things like people who were not Holocaust deniers, but did not know what the Holocaust was, came to show up at a game to play that game. We had survivors, like second generation survivors of the Holocaust. We had second generation perpetrators of the Holocaust, like people whose grandparents were part of the Reich. And we had people who knew very little or only knew about the Holocaust through viewing Schindler's List in high school. And we found marked improvements in their understanding and their contextualization, in their ability to learn, know, and also we've heard a lot of follow-up stories from those people when we contact them 3 or 6 or 12 months later to say, how has the experience of play changed you? We have seen action. People went to Rosenstrasse Square in Berlin to see the history and the memorial that's there. People have talked about when big protests came in the civil rights, in the civil unrest that happened after the George Floyd protests in the summer, people looked at their worlds and were like, I'm not sure I want to go join that, and then started thinking about their experience in the game and about how when you don't act quick enough, change does not come. And so we're encouraged to act because they had practiced the act of resisting as a course of the game. And so I think specifically analog tabletop and LARP games physically allow us to embody it, right? They physically allow us to get into it, walk around, talk the talk, think through the thoughts. It's a different level of personal ownership of the material that we get to. And so it has a different quality of helping pass information, pass action, incur transference, than many other kinds of, it's one of my favorite genres, it's one of my favorite art forms for exactly that reason.
So you mentioned history education, and we know that genocide education is not yet a curricular requirement in most countries. While some teachers introduce Holocaust education through history or literature, many students first encounter the Holocaust and other state-sanctioned and systematic mass murders through non-traditional sources, such as through the comic books, social media accounts, video games, or television shows, films. And I would like to talk about your game, which you have mentioned, Rosenstrasse, Against the Grain and Model Protectorates, and how these games approach the niche topic like the Holocaust or women's struggle during the World War II. So could you first maybe just redescribe again these 3 games, like what their main topics are, and what was the difference, how they differently approached this topic?
For sure. So Rosenstrasse is the game I was just talking about, which is a game centered on the 1943 protest in Berlin, where mixed marriages, so women who the state considered Aryan and their husbands, who were Jewish, had been the last protected Jewish folks that had lived in Berlin. So they had been afforded some level of protection because they were attached to women who were part of the regime. In 1943, those men were taken, and the women in response, in desperation to get their husbands released, spontaneously, without backing or organization, just showed up at the place that they were being held in 24 Rosenstrasse in Berlin and demanded that their husbands be returned to them. And from February 27th-ish to March 6th, they just kept coming back until there were thousands of women in the streets just continuing to insist. And we have and their husbands were released as a part of this action. It was the only action on behalf of the Jews that happened in Germany during the war, and it was successful. And so our game is a game that tracks 4 pairs of people, 3 couples that are existing in that situation, and a brother and sister pair who both are in intermarriages themselves. And it shows a diversity of their experiences in the time from 1933 to 1943 when they were taken. So it goes through the long, slow erosion of civil liberties and then culminates in the men being taken and the protest itself. And so this game was important to us because we have this narrative about the Nazi regime that it was unquestionable, like it was big and forceful and violent and nobody could stand against them. And yet there were these few thousand women who were themselves in vulnerable marriages who just stood up and said no and were successful. And there's work that Nathan Stoltzfus uncovered that showed how the regime may likely have ended the protest and given the men back to end the protest because they were concerned about how the protest would negatively impact the citizens of the Reich and their compliance to the regime. And so the game is for 4 players and a facilitator, and it was just released last year. that's the first one. Against the Grain is a game about the 1943 Western Electric hate strike, which happened in Baltimore, Maryland, where women who were working on the home front in factory work, white women, had the first Black inspector join their crew. So a Black woman joined their crew. And despite the fact that these women were, for their own lives, experiencing better pay, better economic freedom, different ability to do skilled labor, and were enjoying all the freedoms that homefront factory work had for women, they went on a hate strike to protest her ability to work with them, demanding segregation. And so the game focuses on a last moment negotiation between three men and a foreman, three women and a foreman, about what to do, about trying to stop the strike from happening before it happened. It's a fictional moment in history, but it allows players to dive deep into this moment of history. And it was a game that was actually inspired by digging into the history, challenged my understanding of history in a very deep way. I was originally just doing a fun Bomb Girls kind of game. I was like, women and economic freedom, women in the workforce, how the war changed women's lives. It's such a happy story that we all learn as women, especially, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, but especially in American media, it's always this bright, shiny story, and we have the Rosie the Riveter, we can do it kind of thing. And as I was researching, one of the things that I've learned to do through the process of games is to ask what's missing. When I'm reading great narratives about great stories and great history, but what's missing from the course of this? And then go specifically looking to see if I can find it. And one of the things that was missing in all the accounts that I was reading that were just readily and easily available were the stories of Black women. But I saw pictures in the National Archives of Black women working in factories, and this was an era of segregation. So I was like, what's the story here? And found out about this hate strike. And this was a particular moment because on Twitter, this was the birthplace of Black Twitter. So when a Black activists were just getting a real solid voice on Twitter and being quite outspoken and receiving traction in some of their feedback, especially to white feminism, because it was on the tail end of the Me Too movement. And phenomenal Black writer in the States, Mickey Kendall, did a Twitter thread with the hashtag solidarity is for white women. And what it talked about was you have to earn, white women have to earn solidarity. They're not just given it from Black women. We won't trust you. And I found it quite upsetting at the time of reading it. But encountering this story while I was thinking about this situation also made me uncover the ways in which Black workers during the war had to, were told over and over again, don't do this civil rights movement. We're in the middle of a war. After the war, this is World War I now, after the war, we'll talk about your civil rights. And so people in the First World War often pulled back on their civil rights movements, went into the factories. African-American men went off to war, and then came back home and tried to do the civil rights movements and received no traction. Nobody had a memory of those requests. And the same thing happened in World War II, a bid for, oh, be solidarity with us because we're at war and we can't fight a war at home and a war abroad at the same time. And then afterwards, violent suppression of that civil rights movement. And so it gave me a whole different understanding of what solidarity is for white women means. And I realized I can't do the shiny, happy Bomb Girls game anymore because that's not the real truth of it. That's a fiction. I mean, there is truth in it, but it's a fiction we've made up to feel good about our history. This is the reality of our history that led to right now. And so that's what that game is about. And then Model Protectorates came out of my, Model Protectorates is a game based in Denmark under occupation, a family who's starting to get in, some of the family members start to get involved in the resistance and other members do not want to be involved in the resistance, and how that family determines how to move forward in the danger of resistance work. And this game particularly came out of having done a few of the games about World War II and doing a lot more research about women's history. The game is a reflection on who's allowed to take action. So who's allowed to serve in wars, who's allowed to be a resistance member, who's allowed to do violence, and who's constrained from doing those things. And how that then leads to whose stories get told, who's seen as the hero, how we document who those people are. And so in that story, the the adult daughter of the family is being involved in resistance work, and the forces of her family are trying to pull her out of that because there's danger involved in it. And also the men of the family are getting pulled into the danger they didn't want to get into because of our narratives and understanding about violence and who has to do it and who has to do that work. And so that's what that game is about.
In 2021, you have published an article together with Jessica Hammer, which gets published in the International Journal of Designs for Learning, titled Designing Role-Playing Games that Address the Holocaust. Could you please tell us more about this article and what challenges it has addressed?
Oh yeah, for sure. We had a look at, we had already done some good work in developing games for history at this point. And of course, Strauss as a Holocaust game was of utmost importance to us. So we had that same anxiety at the beginning of things about getting things wrong. And so we took a very rigorous approach in how to set up the game. And we looked at the challenges that transformative games have and the worries that people have about games and how they can go wrong. So of course, there's things that we would expect, like historical misconceptions. The people just might get the history wrong, or they might make anachronistic solutions to problems. They might not have enough context to play, so they might not be able to get a footing. They might not understand the world. They might not be able to take action, or like they might not be able to effectively play the game, and they might simplify the stories that they're telling. We had problems where we identified problems where players might over-identify with the characters or the period of time, or play their characters one-dimensionally because a lot of media, because a lot of games are based in agency and what I can do and the big heroic actions I can take. And so they may not understand the constraints of the place that they were in, or they might play them one-dimensionally because a lot of media encourages us to view people, especially historical people or characters, as one-dimensional characters. One of the biggest worries that people have around transformative games, especially around the Holocaust, was blaming the victims. So I played this game. The outcome you don't want is I played this game and I don't understand why they didn't just up and leave Berlin, right? That would be a big concern. Or unrealistic expectations. They should have just formed a mass protest in the streets right from the very beginning and fought back, ignoring that there were a lot of restrictions and a lot of time spent in between those times that it happens. Players might have inappropriate fun. So they might just super get into the idea of playing in the Holocaust and play for a wrong kind of fun, to play for trauma, to play for misery, and to fetishize the suffering of people that they're playing. And of course, because it's such heavy material, that players may have a distressing or upsetting experience as a result of play. So those were the main dichotomies we were looking at. And so we set out to make a game that was structured for as much safety as possible. So we had deeply entrenched consent mechanisms in play, was a big part of it. So we let players know what they were getting into, for sure. We gave them content warnings. We contextualized their understanding about the Holocaust so they would know the other people at the table and know who they were affecting, which is especially important at tables where there are survivors of the Holocaust and just people who've never had much contact, or people who have been part of families who were perpetrators of the Holocaust. We have ongoing consent requests that happen. We have safety mechanics baked in, and we reduce the loads of the facilitator in as much as possible. So we put a facilitator in the game to make sure that there was someone who knew the history, knew the thrust of the game, and who was well supported to support the players through the experience of play. And also, unlike a lot of traditional role-playing games, where the facilitator has to handle a lot of things all at once, like I have to make up a scene and I have to give you a challenge and I have to get you to engage a mechanic. We streamlined and reduced the responsibilities of our facilitator so that they could focus on emotional monitoring and response at the table. So making sure people were okay, and governing the historical information, and working with people. So they had space for emotions work. We challenged a lot of the historical issues with ideas around contrasting cases. So in the game, we have a lot of contrasting cases. Like the historical Warbirds games have always been wholly from the women's experience. that would be inappropriate in this game because the Holocaust is the experience of the people who suffered it, not the people who protested outside. And we love the story of the people who protested outside, but we can't have their positioning as characters overshadow the people who have actually been taken. So we have players playing two separate characters, play a wife in one context and a husband in another context, and they are in two different relationships that have two different relationships with the world and with privilege and with the Holocaust. And so that they can contrast how that feels between the two of them, and that one story doesn't overshadow another story. And that by playing through those and then watching other players at the table play two other relationships that are there, they have now an eightfold story that's happening at the table. So we are not reducing the narrative of, say, the Jewish men in the story to a single story of victimhood, which is a common problem with historical narratives. We are not implementing a story of the women as just brave, courageous stand-uppers, because there's a lot more to the story than that. And so we allowed all of this dimensionality and contrasting cases to help people contextualize the work and to help them learn differently. And through the concept of it, have learned from one to offset another, if that makes sense. Also, we provided and scaffolded in the game all of the historical information. So you don't need to know anything about the history before reading the game. The game provides it all to you. And probably most importantly, we constrained agency in the game so that you weren't making choices about what you were doing. You were making choices about how you were coping. And so nobody will ever turn to you in the course of the game and say, what do you do at this moment in time? Because that will invite you to take inappropriate action or to take ahistorical action or to see the world as an open-ended possibility. What we say is, for example, there is a scene in the book, a scene in the game that is, the Jews during this period, the 5 years before the war were forbidden from going into bomb shelters, but there was bombing happening all the time. And so there's a scene in the game where a husband and wife who cannot go to the bomb shelters are huddling in a coal shed. So they're not safe, it's super scary. And they are, the main focus of the scene is to have them discuss how, have one of them comfort each other, how they find ways to deal with what's happening to them, or how they make sense of the world around them. And by this, we are looking to have, by this, we are taking things out of the hands of the what and going into the how. We're pulling on people's expertise of being humans rather than their expertise of being historical, is probably the best way of putting it. And so those were some of the main, there's more to it than that, but it's a super complex game. So there's this many layers, many scaffolds of work that went into making players comfortable, making sure they had the information that would make them able to play the game and easy to play the game, and to make them feel safer or more approachable in doing it, and also to safeguard them from treading into the wrong territory that players or game creators are often afraid to go into.
Thank you. Talking more about historical education, the importance of the dissemination of memory in the teaching of history and preserving historical memory has become even more important today, as the pressing demand to remember how authoritarian regimes came around and how they were overcome has grown. What can be done to bring the message never again more effectively close to students, and how can we preserve women's histories through games?
Yeah, I think that more is is really it. I think that all the more exposure that we have where we complexify stories, and that means complexifying whose stories are getting told, complexifying what stories we're choosing, complexifying the role of the people that are in the stories, and the more games that allow us to really engage with the material rather than just, for example, there is a series of games out there where they recently that are historical games that are about taking place in the war, being an active combatant in the war. And they chose specific people who were actual historical people that were women. There was at least one character that was a woman who was actively participating in resistance work. And that was great because it challenged the notion that women weren't here. But also it doesn't complexify the way you engage with that role. So you're still going off and fighting a good fight and being victorious and being a hero, and still reinforcing the narrative. It's saying women can be here, but here, the important here is active combat. So having more and more different varieties and different diversity of stories that are out there that challenge our notions about how we fight back, or how we remember, or how we are, helps to enrich the field in a very important way. And the more we can challenge ourselves to think more complexly and more deeply about information, the more we can learn lessons like never again. Like when we did Rosenstrauss, one of our big goals was to ask people the question, how many different things does it take? How many years, how many actions, how many suppressions of civil liberties will it take before you feel like you can say something? How many people are complicit in this action? That it is not a handful of violent leaders enacting a totalitarian regime. It is the ongoing quiet complicity of 1 million people letting it happen, or not speaking up when they see injustice. And pose the question that says, in this moment of history, this protest was successful. So therefore, at what point before, how many more people could you have had an impact on? How differently might the war, or might the experience of the people of the Holocaust been if it had happened earlier? And you may stand up for your husband, but you didn't stand up for anybody else's beforehand. So there's lots of those kind of questions. Really getting it under your skin and getting that feeling, I think, is the secret to going out into the world and seeing where problems are and learning to stand up, and learning that despite what history tells us, resistance is effective, can be effective, and education can change people's minds. And the long, slow work of educating people is the core of how resistance happens. And so games are fun ways to engage that. And fun is a funny way to put a game when we talk about a game about the Holocaust, but it's a kind of fun, like watching an incredible drama is fun. It's an entertainment, but it's an entertainment that teaches you something, hits home, changes you in some way, and informs you about the world that you're in.
History can be lost or distorted, even fractured by contested interpretations of the past. For example, the far right, the modern far right, interprets events of the Holocaust or events connected to the Second World War differently than the majority of people interprets it. And it is throughout the tabletop games we can fight against these interpretations, because some students maybe first encounter Holocaust through one of these interpretations on an online forum, and for a while he or she will be convinced that that's what really happened.
I think to some extent, the current era of post-truth is super concerning. And I don't believe the games can fix it, but I do believe the games can influence it. In that, if you in studies, or when they talk about how people come to a understanding or an acceptance of someone different from themselves, the first and foremost answer always is, I knew somebody. Like, for example, people who have never had a trans person in their life do not understand that that person is a person. They hear a narrative that they're given and it doesn't make sense, and they don't have a depth of understanding. So it becomes easy to buy into predatory stories and terrible hate-based propaganda. But knowing a person complexifies how you feel about a situation. If you are if you have to sit across the table from a person of color and have them tell you how you have impacted them, you will hear that differently than just having someone talking about it on Twitter. So the closer you can get to a person's emotional center, the more likely you are to give them an ounce of complexity. And that ounce of complexity is one of the ways out of post-truth, right? The current era of information is over-identification, over-individuality, like it's just me and mine and my freedoms. It's just me and my rights. To heck with anybody else. They are just against us, and their reality does not make sense to me. And that's why people become very susceptible to false narratives, because it just fits in to sitting in a comfortable worldview. And I also think that we introduce more scarcity and precarity to people in the world, they become more likely to fall into hate-based narratives. So games can introduce complexity, they can introduce empathy, they can give you an ounce of, well, maybe I can think differently about this. However, games have to be in people's lives to get there, right? And what we are getting to is, I don't believe that a Holocaust denier is going to show up to a game about, to Rosenstrauss in good faith, with an open heart to learn about it, right? So there's an obstacle that we have in front of it. So different kinds of games have different ways of managing it. And that game is different if I'm just offering the game to run the game for someone versus a Holocaust Education Center is running the game for people with a, like a teaching guide in place. But we have to get to people to do it, and they have to want to engage in it. I think that that's a big problem with games, is that they allow us to have good experiences and get to people earlier to complexify their future understanding. I think that's the biggest hope, right? If we can get to people earlier, if we can give them better stories, if we can give them better historical knowledge, that when they encounter the post-truth, it'll hit wrong. They won't buy in because they already have a more complex narrative. And I think that games in education are particularly important, because employing them earlier in the process, before you're just out in the world listening to the internet or tuning into the alt-right news, that's when games help most, by setting you up to understand the world complexly.
Thank you. So my next question, one of the last ones, is focusing on the online gaming community, but I think both online and offline gaming community is kind of part of a greater nerd culture, so might have some common points. Do you view the gaming community as a community which is vulnerable to the influences of far-right rhetoric, and gaming platforms as a platform for youth radicalization? What can be done to fight online hate, misogyny, and anti-Semitism on gaming and gaming-related platforms?
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I've lived experience of how toxic the gaming environments can be. We have, gaming is just a microcosm of the greater society. So it's anything that's in greater society is going to be here, but even more so in any small tight-knit sub-community, especially a tight-knit sub-community that often identifies itself as marginally disadvantaged, even if it isn't. So gamers, in some extent, there are narratives within gaming sub-communities around, we were the nerds and we were the we were the nerds and we were hard done by when we were young, and gaming is our safe haven. Gaming is our place to be. And so that birthed movements like Gamergate, which is like trying to push representation out of media, harassing women online, those kind of things. Plus, there's just handfuls of designers, just like there are people like me in the world that want to use games to put forward empathy and complexity and develop our understanding and capacity to fight in the world. There are, I am sure, people who are doing the opposite, right? And there is more traction to their work than there is to those who are resisting it, because gaming, online or analog, all kind of come out of a combative history, out of war games for the analog role-playing communities. It's like out of Dungeons and Dragons and the history of tabletop wargaming. For the most the easiest sell video games of my youth back too long ago were were games where you fight people. Like gaming is about agency and action and excitement, right? So agency, action, and excitement, and the personification of me is I go out and do a thing. And where stories become interesting is in conflict. And the easiest source of conflict is violence. And the easiest source of conflict, in violence is often war-based. Or what they would call in the tabletop role-playing game communities, murder hobos. Like, we are a group of adventurers who go off into the world, we explore, we kill beasts like kobolds and dragons and those kind of things, and we take their money and we go back home rich, right? And so, which is clearly both a aggressor hostility and a colonialistic mentality. And a lot of our games are based in those things. So there's already a lot to overcome. And a lot of people come to play those games to relax and have fun and don't want to think too closely about it. Online communities believe that a lot of online communities that are inhabited by the alt-right believe that world is their home, right? They have the deed to the house of gaming. And that's what it is. That's what it's always been. That's what it's for. In the same way that Hollywood doesn't think that it's sustainable to have a woman-led movie or a movie about women, the gamer alt-right communities, especially in misogyny, believe that gaming is a male hobby meant for men. They are the real gamers. Nobody else matters. And they feel, just like many alt-right tenors feel, that their worlds are being taken away from them. It's all, frankly, white replacement theory, right? They believe that their privilege and predominancy in the world is being narrowed, and they're fighting back about anybody taking any more space. And in an era of the internet, that then becomes an era of anonymity. I don't know a woman or a non-binary person or a person of color in the gaming industry who has not faced hate online, who has not had targeted stuff pointed directly at them in their inboxes or in public. And because there is an engagement of terrorism in those communities to try and make people stand down or back off. And what we can do about it, I mean, I think it's a bigger problem in the gaming communities, right? So like legislatively, the world has not caught up on, like, I can't walk over to my neighbor's house and threaten their lives. I would get arrested and go to jail. But I can, if I want to, threaten someone's life anonymously online and have no consequence whatever. I can even do it fully not anonymously online, and people won't take it seriously because it's just talk on the internet. The legislative bodies haven't caught up to it. And the bigger problem is probably that the companies that support online talk profit from it, right? The more conflict that we have, the more clicks we get, the more advertising gets seen, the more Twitter and social media companies, or the more active the forums at the Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons forum or wherever it is, the more active online engagement is, the more profitable it is for the person that is hosting it. And therefore, there is no incentive to quell or contain or protect marginalized voices. And so it's going to take the evolution of organizations to protect those voices, or the evolutions of legislation or governments to protect those voices. And like, there has to be moderation policies where if you participate in online hate, someone can report you and you can be deplatformed from the site. There has to be consequences, and there isn't today. And then of course, we haven't even gotten into doxing or real world, like what happened to Anita Sarkeesian in having to move and to delist all her phone numbers and to make sure people didn't know where she was because she was getting death threats, deeply disturbing anti-Semitic death threats. And so yeah, it's a very dismal space. And it's just, as we are currently living in a media world that is like, we've hit the nerd world, right? Our biggest movies are Marvel movies, now people play games like they have never played games in terms of video games. Dungeons and Dragons is exploding. Online role-playing game communities are creating whole new things. We are in a renaissance of what games are and how they do. And I believe the gaming industry is a bigger piece than the music industry now. And so it's a place that has fostered in darkness for a long time and hasn't reckoned with the fact that it's the biggest player on the block and is not doing a lot to protect its people.
Thank you. And my last question. So on campuses across the globe, professors are putting historically based games into their classroom. And which game would you personally select to raise awareness about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, women's issues, and or growing online or offline hate?
So if I was, I can't have put all the time and effort I put into Rose and Strauss without recommending it. We specifically designed it for use in that way, not at high schools and not as mandatory training, but specifically for education centers or universities or other Holocaust education venues to be able to use it. So it's custom built for it. There are other games that I have played in on video games that I've enjoyed. I probably should have written down a list before coming in because my brain is going blank. Through the Darkest of Times was a game that I thought was quite interesting, and it was about the difficulties and complexities of running a resistance movement in Germany during the war. Would be a good example of them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.